Margaret sat quietly at the edge of the kitchen table, her hands wrinkled and worn from years of work and care, gently folding Liam's freshly laundered clothes. The house was alive with the usual sounds, cartoons blaring from the living room, TV, footsteps running up and down the stairs, and the sharp clicking of Claire's heels as she walked past, talking loudly on her phone. It had been months since Margaret moved in with her son Daniel and his family. She had come with the hope of helping, of being useful, of spending her golden years surrounded by love and laughter. But love, she realized, was being redefined in this house. Her grandson Liam, once a sweet boy with curly hair and a shy smile, had turned cold and entitled. He had everything: a tablet, gaming console, toys that filled half the house, and with each gift, it seemed he lost a little more kindness. Claire, her daughter-in-law, insisted on giving Liam whatever he wanted, calling it positive parenting. But Margaret could see the change. Liam didn't say please or thank you. He rolled his eyes at everyone, shouted when told no, and threw tantrums over the smallest things. Margaret had tried gently correcting him. Once, she told him not to snatch a toy from another child. Another time, she asked him not to shout at the maid. Each time, Claire stepped in like a storm. "He's just a kid, Mom. Don't be so harsh," she'd say with a forced smile. Daniel, her son, would avoid confrontation entirely. "Let's not make it a big deal," he'd mutter, eyes glued to his laptop. But Margaret could feel the growing tension. She wasn't trying to control things. She just wanted to help Liam grow into a good person. That morning, everything changed. It started like any other day. Margaret stood near the stove preparing tea. Liam came barreling into the kitchen, yelling something about his broken tablet. "Don't run in here, Liam," Margaret said calmly. "There's hot water. You could get hurt." He stopped, stared at her with those narrowed eyes that no 8-year-old should have, and said nothing. She turned her back for a moment to reach the sugar jar. And then, a scream ripped through the kitchen. Boiling water splashed across her back and shoulder. The pain was instant, blinding. She dropped the kettle. The floor clattered with the sound of metal. Her body hunched as her knees gave in. Claire and Daniel came rushing in at the sound. "What happened?" Claire cried. Margaret was shaking, holding the edge of the counter for support. "He threw it. He threw the water at me." Liam stood behind them, expressionless, almost smug. His hands were clean. The mug he had flung now lay on the floor. But Claire's reaction crushed Margaret more than the scalding water ever could. "He's just a kid," Claire said, clutching Liam to her. "He doesn't know what he's doing." Margaret looked up, disbelief frozen on her face. "He looked me straight in the eyes before doing it. He knew." Daniel placed a hand on his mother's shoulder, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Mom? It must have been an accident. He probably didn't mean it." The pain from the burn was sharp, but the pain from that moment of being dismissed, disrespected, and doubted cut deeper than anything. She sat alone in her room later that night, applying burn cream to the angry red skin along her shoulder and back. The ointment soothed little. The betrayal, however, stayed hot in her chest. She had never imagined that the boy she had once cradled in her arms would one day hurt her like this, and worse, that her own family would excuse it. Margaret stared at the family photos on the shelf. Pictures of her, Daniel as a baby, and even one of her late husband. A soft sigh escaped her lips. She wasn't just physically hurt. She felt invisible, unwanted, a burden. That night, as the house fell asleep and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and made a quiet, painful decision. She would leave, but she wouldn't leave empty-handed. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Margaret sat at the edge of her bed. The house was quiet. She could hear the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Her back still throbbed from the burn, but that wasn't what kept her awake. It was the words from the night before. He's just a kid, and maybe it was an accident. She had devoted her entire life to her son Daniel. She had been there when his father died, working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She was the one who taught him to tie his shoes, to be honest, to say thank you. And now he couldn't even stand up for her when his son did something so cruel. Margaret stood up slowly and walked over to the wardrobe. She opened it quietly and took out a small travel bag. It wasn't the first time she had packed this bag. Years ago, she had used it on short visits, weddings, funerals. But today, she packed it with a different purpose. Not to attend something, but to leave something behind. She placed a few sets of clothes neatly inside, her toiletries, and her small pouch of medicines. Then she paused. Her eyes drifted toward the small wooden chest on the top shelf of her closet. Inside it were the only things that truly mattered to her. Old letters from her husband, her wedding ring, a tiny locket with Daniel's baby photo, and her parents' property documents. She opened the chest and pulled out the papers. Among them was the deed to a small cottage in a quiet countryside town, her family's ancestral home. Years ago, when Daniel was struggling financially, she had added his name to the deed just to help him with credit and bank issues. But he never cared about that house. "It's too old," he had once said. "We'll sell it someday." But now, that little house felt like salvation. She glanced around the room one last time. It wasn't just a room. It had been her home. But over the months, it had become a space filled with silence, tension, and unspoken rejection. She had stayed because she believed family meant sticking together. But if family meant being hurt and ignored, maybe it was time to redefine what home meant. As she stepped out into the hallway, she walked past the family's display cabinet. Inside were framed photographs, wedding pictures of Daniel and Claire, Liam's baby photos, and a dusty photo album she had lovingly maintained for years. It hadn't been touched in ages. She opened it, flipped through the pages, her memories, carefully arranged with captions in her handwriting. Without hesitation, she slipped it into her bag. "They never even look at it," she whispered. "But these are mine." Downstairs, the kitchen was dark. She turned on one light and walked to the counter. There, she tore a sheet from Claire's notepad and wrote, "I raised my voice once, and got burned. I protected your child once, and got blamed. I won't stay where I'm no longer respected. I took what belongs to me. My memories, my peace, and the home you forgot existed. Mom." She didn't sign it in anger. She signed it with calm, with finality. With her bag in hand and scarf wrapped around her shoulders, she stepped outside. The morning air was cold, and the streets were still. She called a taxi from her phone and waited at the edge of the street. As the cab pulled up, she took one last glance at the house, the home she had helped build, the walls that once echoed with her lullabies and prayers. She felt no hate, just deep sorrow. As she climbed into the back seat, she clutched her bag tightly. Inside, it wasn't just clothing or a photo album. Inside, it was her dignity, her self-respect, and the decision to no longer be invisible. The cab driver looked at her through the mirror and asked gently, "Where to, ma'am?" Margaret smiled faintly and said, "Home." Not the house she left, but the cottage that still held her name, her roots, and maybe a second chance at peace. The countryside came into view like a soft painting as the taxi curved through narrow roads lined with tall trees and dew-covered fields. The early morning fog was just beginning to lift, and golden sunlight filtered through the leaves. Margaret hadn't been to the cottage in over a decade. The last time was during a family vacation when Daniel was still a teenager, before he had met Claire, before the world became complicated. As the cab pulled into the long dirt driveway, the cottage revealed itself, small, weathered by time, but still standing strong. It had white walls stained with years of rain and moss, a blue wooden door, and windows that looked like sleepy eyes peeking through flowered curtains. Wildflowers had taken over the garden. Ivy crawled across one side of the porch and the mailbox tilted slightly, but to Margaret, it was beautiful. She stepped out of the cab, her back aching, her body weary, but her heart beating in a way it hadn't in years, with purpose. "Are you sure this is the place?" the driver asked, concerned by the overgrowth and how remote it looked. Margaret nodded. "This is exactly where I need to be." She paid him, waved politely, and watched as the car disappeared back down the road. Alone now, she approached the door and turned the key, still tucked inside her old wallet after all these years. The lock clicked, and with a gentle push, the door opened with a creak. Inside, the air was musty but familiar. A thin layer of dust covered the wooden furniture, and spiderwebs hung from the corners. The fireplace was cold, the kitchen untouched, but the place felt like it had been waiting for her. She moved through the rooms slowly, each one holding a memory. Her mother's old rocking chair in the corner, her father's walking stick hanging by the front door. A faded quilt folded at the end of the bed. The walls still held faint pencil marks from when Daniel had measured his height as a child. Margaret sat down in the living room and allowed herself a moment to cry, not out of sadness, but release. The pressure, the silence, the pain from her son's house, all of it poured out of her now in quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks. No one was there to interrupt her. No one was there to say, "He's just a kid." She was free to feel the Next few hours were spent dusting, opening windows, and airing out rooms. She moved slowly, carefully, still sore from the burn, but with a determination that surprised even her. She made a small meal from canned food left in the kitchen, boiled, some tea, and sat on the back porch as the sun warmed the air. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret heard the sound of her own breath and her own thoughts. That night, she slept on the old bed with fresh sheets she found in the closet. The window beside her was cracked open, letting in the sound of distant crickets and the occasional breeze. As she closed her eyes, a deep calm settled over her. In the morning, she walked to the nearby village market, a 10-minute stroll along a gravel road. People still remembered her. An old woman named Doris, who once ran the local library, called out, "Margaret, is that really you?" Soon, others recognized her. A man from the bakery gave her extra bread. A girl from the fruit stall smiled warmly and offered fresh apples. It wasn't loud affection or dramatic welcomes, just kind eyes and quiet familiarity. It was enough. Later that day, she found a letter in her bag she had forgotten, something Daniel had written to her years ago on her birthday, back when he was kind and grateful. She read it slowly, then folded it and placed it by the fireplace. That evening, she lit the fireplace and sat with a blanket draped around her shoulders. Flames flickered, casting shadows on the walls. She didn't know what the future held or if Daniel would even care that she was gone. But she knew this. She had not left in bitterness. She had left to find herself again, and in the stillness of that little forgotten cottage, she did. It had been 3 days since Margaret arrived at the cottage, and something inside her had begun to shift. At first, the silence had felt unfamiliar, almost too loud. But now, she embraced it. Each morning, she awoke to the chirping of birds and the warmth of sunlight brushing her face through the cottage window. She made her own tea, slowly walked through the wild garden, and scribbled thoughts in a notebook she found in a drawer. She had no television, no loud voices, no one calling her a burden or brushing off her pain. For the first time in years, she wasn't just someone's mother, someone's grandmother, or someone expected to stay silent. She was simply Margaret. But back in the city, her absence was finally being noticed. Daniel came downstairs on the 3rd day to find Claire pacing, her face flushed with frustration. "I tried calling your mother all morning," she said, waving her phone. "It keeps going straight to voicemail." Daniel furrowed his brow. Maybe she just went to the market, or took a walk. Claire picked up the note still sitting on the counter, ignored until now. She read it again aloud, slower this time. "I'm going where I'm seen, not where I'm tolerated. Don't worry, I took only what was mine." Daniel's face paled as the words sank in. Wait, what does she mean by took something? He ran to the safe in his study, unlocked it, and stared. The deed, gone. His jaw tightened. "She took the cottage papers," he said aloud. Claire frowned. "That old place? We were going to sell it eventually. Why would she go there?" But Daniel couldn't answer. All he could hear now were the words he had told his mother. He's just a kid. All he could remember was the pain on her face after Liam's cruel act. And suddenly he felt ashamed. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in the garden near a patch of overgrown lavender, trimming it carefully with a pair of old scissors. It was quiet work, but peaceful. A neighbor named Sam, an older man who used to help her father with repairs, dropped by with a wooden box of fresh vegetables. "Figured you might need a few things," he said with a kind smile. Margaret took the box, her eyes welling with tears she hadn't expected. "You didn't have to do this," Sam shrugged. "You helped half this village once. We remember." After he left, Margaret took one of the tomatoes and bit into it, savoring the fresh taste. It reminded her of summers long past, of barefoot, walks through muddy fields and nights spent under mosquito nets. That evening, as she sipped her tea by the fireplace, a familiar ringtone buzzed on the counter. Her old phone, fully charged now, lit up with Daniel's name flashing on the screen. She stared at it, let it ring. It stopped, then rang again. Finally, she answered. "Hello? Mom," Daniel said, breathless. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm fine," she said simply. "I'm home." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how badly things had gotten. I should have done more. I should have listened." Margaret didn't speak right away. Then she said, "You did realize. You just chose to stay quiet." Daniel's voice cracked. "Liam misses you." "No, Daniel," she replied gently. "Liam misses being told yes. He doesn't miss me. Not yet. I want to fix this." "You can't fix what you don't understand," she said softly. "You can't teach him respect if you've forgotten how to show it to your own mother." There was a long pause. "I'd like to come visit," he said finally. "If that's okay." Margaret looked out the window. The stars had begun to appear, twinkling above the trees. She exhaled deeply and replied, "When you're ready to visit, not just to bring me back but to understand why I left, the door will be open." Then she hung up. She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. For years, she had waited for their time, their attention, their appreciation. Now they could wait for hers. A week passed. Margaret's days at the cottage followed a quiet, comforting rhythm. She tended the garden in the morning, baked in the afternoon, and read by the fireplace in the evenings. Though her back still bore the scars of that burn, her heart had started to heal in ways she didn't think were possible. But despite the peace, part of her mind remained restless. Not with regret, but with wonder. Would they change? Did they even care enough to? Then one afternoon, as she was watering the rose bushes, she saw a familiar car creeping down the long dirt path. The tires crunched the gravel, slow and unsure, like the driver didn't know whether to keep going or turn back. It was Daniel. He stepped out awkwardly, holding a small bag in one hand and Liam in the other. The boy looked different. Not in his clothes, not in his height, but in his eyes. He wasn't wide-eyed and entitled today. He looked nervous, almost small. Margaret didn't move. She simply stood there, the watering can dangling from her hand. Daniel approached carefully. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice cautious. "I hope this isn't a bad time." Margaret looked him over. He looked tired. The stubble on his chin, the deep lines around his eyes. He had lost sleep. "I didn't expect you," she said plainly. "I know," Daniel replied, "but I needed to come. Not to take you home, just to be here." Margaret nodded once and stepped aside, gesturing toward the porch. "Then come in." Inside the cottage, Margaret poured tea for all three of them. The silence was heavy, but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that held unspoken words, waiting for someone to break through. Daniel looked around at the cottage. "It's smaller than I remember," he murmured, "but it's warm." Margaret sipped her tea. Small things can still hold big love, if they're cared for. Liam sat quietly, his legs swinging nervously beneath the chair. He clutched something in his hands. A folded paper. "Grandma," he said, eyes lowered. "I'm sorry." Margaret looked at him carefully. "What are you sorry for, Liam?" He swallowed. For the water. I was angry. I thought it was funny, but it wasn't. It hurt you. And Daddy said hurting someone, even if you're young, still matters. Margaret's eyes welled, but she held steady. That's true. Liam opened the paper. It was a drawing. Her, standing in the garden, with flowers and the sun shining above. I made this for you, he said, pushing it across the table. She took the paper gently. It was childish, but sincere. Thank you, she whispered. That means a lot. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, I failed you. I let Claire's parenting ideas, my work, my comfort, make me blind. I saw things. I just didn't want to confront them. You tried to help Liam, and I treated you like an inconvenience. Margaret's lips trembled. She had waited so long to hear those words. You didn't just treat me like I didn't matter, she said quietly. You made excuses for someone who hurt me. You sided with silence. Daniel nodded, shame in his eyes. I know. That's why I wanted to come here and ask, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to do better. She studied him for a moment, then looked at Liam. Raising a child isn't just about feeding them and keeping them happy. It's about teaching them respect, empathy, and kindness. And when those things are missing, it's the adults who are to blame. I know, Daniel said. I'm learning. I hope it's not too late. Margaret stood and walked over to the fireplace. She picked up the family photo album, the one she had taken from their house, and opened it to a page with Daniel's 5th birthday. This was when you made me a card out of pasta and glue. You were a good boy, not perfect. But you listened. Daniel smiled faintly. I want Liam to grow up that way too. Margaret closed the album. Then start listening again. They spent the afternoon in the garden. Liam helped her plant new seeds. Daniel cleaned the porch. No one talked about the return trip. No one asked her to pack. They simply existed together, quietly, respectfully. As the sun began to set, Daniel said, We'll head back in the morning, but if it's all right, we'd like to stay tonight. Margaret nodded. The spare room's still yours. That night, as she watched Liam sleep on the couch with a blanket tucked up to his chin, Margaret felt something shift again. Not in her, but in them. Maybe they had started to remember. Morning sunlight bathed the cottage in a soft golden glow. Birds chirped outside, and dew sparkled on the leaves as if the world itself had decided to start fresh. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, quietly making breakfast, eggs, toast, and tea, the way she always had. But today, it felt different. Daniel came downstairs first, rubbing his eyes, still adjusting to the calm. Smells like home, he said softly. Margaret looked at him, a brief smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It always did. You just forgot. Liam followed, slower, dragging a pillow with him and holding it like a stuffed animal. He seemed gentler now, quieter. There was no tantrum, no demand for a phone or cartoons. Just the quiet presence of a boy starting to understand the meaning of consequences and compassion. As they sat down at the table, the air was warmer than it had been in years. Not because of the fire, but because of the unspoken effort everyone was making to simply be present. Daniel cleared his throat. Claire wanted to come too, he said, stirring his tea. But I told her this wasn't about appearances. It was about truth. Margaret nodded. Claire has her way of raising Liam, but if that way doesn't include accountability, it will destroy him. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I know. I've already seen it start, and I let it grow because it was easier than confronting it. Margaret's voice was calm but steady. Do you know what the hardest part was, Daniel? It wasn't the burn. It wasn't even the excuses. It was feeling invisible in a home I helped build. He bowed his head. I made you feel that way. Yes, she said plainly. And now you'll have to decide if you want to rebuild trust, or just let this visit be a formality. Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it on the table. What's this? Margaret asked, wary. The deed to the cottage, he said. I went to the lawyer, took my name off it. I had no right to be on it, in the first place. It's yours now, completely. No strings. She stared at it for a long moment, then slowly reached out and slid it toward her. I didn't leave to take revenge, Daniel, she said. I left because staying any longer would have broken me. I know, he said, and I'm grateful you left. It woke me up. After breakfast, Liam helped Margaret with the dishes. He didn't complain. He didn't need a reward. He just wanted to help. As she dried the plates, he stood beside her and looked up. Grandma, can I come stay with you one weekend? He asked. I want to help with the garden. Margaret looked down, touched by the innocence in his voice. Yes, sweetheart, you can, but only if you promise to always be kind while you're here. He nodded earnestly. I promise. Daniel watched the exchange, his heart heavy with emotion. He knew it would take time, but this moment, this chance, was the beginning. They packed their things after lunch. Margaret walked them to the car, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Daniel opened the door and paused before getting in. Mom, he said, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to earn it anyway. You don't need to earn it, she replied. You just need to remember it matters. He nodded, eyes stinging, then leaned in and hugged her, longer and tighter than he had in years. Liam hugged her too, small arms around her waist. Thank you for not hating me, he whispered. I could never hate you, she whispered back. But I want you to grow into someone I can always be proud of. As the car pulled away down the gravel road, Margaret stood there for a moment, her hand raised in a quiet goodbye. She didn't go back inside right away. She walked through her garden, the earth soft beneath her feet. She touched the lavender, bushes, now trimmed and thriving. She smiled. She hadn't taken revenge. She had taken back her peace, and now they understood what they had almost lost. Not a house, not a deed, not an old woman, but a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had always loved deeply and finally chose to love herself just as much.